You're a burden. Carry that baby and get out of my house." Her words hit me like a thunderclap in the stifling Miami kitchen. Sharp and merciless, the ocean breeze outside, doing nothing to soften them. My mother's eyes were icy, void of concern, void of any hint that the child I carried was her grandchild. Only a cold calculation. I had to disappear before the secret she'd buried for years came to light. I didn't beg, didn't plead. Quietly, I reached under the table and pulled out the small, unassuming box I had been guarding for months, 3 years' worth of loan notices she had forged in my name at 18, signatures perfected, while I innocently acted as her secretary for her food distribution business. I placed the box on the counter right atop her placemat and walked out into the Miami rain without a word. 5 years later, my lawyer's voice came over the phone, steady and precise. "Ma'am, your mother is in the conference room ready to sign." From my office window, the same Miami skyline that had once watched me sleep in a car now reflected my tailored suit and unwavering gaze. I smiled, the quiet, controlled smile of someone who had spent half a decade transforming betrayal into power, and said, "Let her wait a little longer." That small box had carried the weight of every stolen opportunity, every cruel word, every sleepless night, and it was about to bring her carefully constructed world crashing down. Before I reveal exactly what was inside and how it toppled, her empire, hit like and subscribe if you've ever felt the sting of family betrayal, because sometimes the coldest love comes from the very people who claim to care the most. 5 years earlier, right after I stepped out of that kitchen door, the warm Miami rain soaked through my thin jacket as I walked to my car, each drop feeling heavier than the last. My mother had turned me into her escape hatch long before that night. When I was 18, she convinced me to become the corporate secretary for her food distribution company, claiming it was a simple favor to pad my resume. I signed every document she placed in front of me without reading, closely trusting her completely. Those signatures were personal guarantees on loans she had already stretched beyond reason. She used my spotless credit to keep borrowing, while her accounts quietly collapsed under the weight of bad deals and overextended suppliers. The first collection letters arrived in my name a few months later, thick envelopes stamped with red warnings. I brought them to her one evening after my shift, voice shaking as I asked why my name was tied to debts I never agreed to take on. She dismissed me instantly, called me hysterical, said I was overreacting to adult problems I couldn't possibly understand. Laura stood in the doorway with her arms folded, smirking, as she added that I was embarrassing the family by making a fuss over nothing. Margaret never offered an explanation. Instead, she forged more papers, perfecting my handwriting until the banks accepted them without question. The pressure built until my credit score cratered, and every application I submitted was denied. By the time I reached 6 months pregnant, the notices had become impossible to ignore. That was the moment she chose to act. She waited until my belly was visibly round, then used the pregnancy as her perfect excuse to sever ties before the banks or creditors connected the dots back to her. She screamed that I was a burden, dragging the family name down, that I would ruin everything if I stayed. Laura watched silently from the hallway, offering no defense, only that same detached smile she always wore when she sided with power. I left with nothing but the clothes I wore and a handful of cash from my last paycheck. For the next 2 weeks, I slept in my car in quiet parking lots near the beach, reclining the seat as far as it would go. Windows cracked to let in the salty air, while my body ached from the growing weight inside me. Every time I approached a leasing office, the agents pulled up my report and shook their heads. One woman looked at me with a mix of pity and caution, saying she couldn't take the risk. I finally found a landlord willing to accept cash under the table, but those first nights tested everything I had left. I would rest my hands on my belly, whispering promises to Sophia that her mother was not broken, that we would build something solid, no matter how hard the start. I promised her she would never know the feeling of being discarded like a liability. I didn't cry from the cold or the loneliness. I cried because the truth finally settled in: the woman who raised me had used me as a shield to protect her own failures. And I still wonder, if someone turned your trust into their safety net and then pushed you out when it got too heavy, would you forgive them or walk away forever? Now, standing in my law office in downtown Miami, I look out at the skyline stretching toward the ocean, the same city that once forced me to sleep in my car, now framing the view from floor-to-ceiling windows. The girl who shivered through those nights has become a lawyer specializing in distressed debt, turning other people's bad loans into steady profit. It took 5 full years of relentless work to get here. I enrolled in night classes at a local law school while holding down 2 jobs during the day, studying contracts and bankruptcy law between shifts and feedings after Sophia was born. Every rejection letter from firms pushed me harder until I passed the bar and started at a small collections practice that handled regional bank portfolios. I learned fast how banks grow tired of chasing dead-end borrowers and sell those notes at deep discounts. I began buying small batches myself, negotiating with vice presidents who were desperate to clean their books before quarterly reports. Each deal taught me more about leverage timing and the quiet power of patience. Profits grew slowly at first, then steadily, allowing me to build my own practice focused entirely on acquiring and collecting non-performing loans across Florida. One afternoon, while reviewing new portfolios from community banks in the Miami area, I spotted a familiar name: my mother's food distribution company. The numbers were grim, over-leveraged on expansion projects that never materialized, suppliers' unpaid interest compounding monthly. The total distressed debt hovered around $450,000, enough to force liquidation if the banks called it in. Margaret had always been skilled at shaking hands and promising big deliveries, but terrible at managing cash flow. She thought the regional economy was the problem, not her decisions. She had no clue the invisible pressure tightening around her throat was mine. I didn't rush. I contacted the 3 local banks holding her overdue notes separately, offering to take the toxic assets off their books at 60 cents on the dollar. They were exhausted from her excuses and eager to avoid defaults hitting their records. They thanked me, signed the transfer papers, and just like that, I became the primary holder of her debt, anonymous through a shell entity, so she wouldn't see my name until the trap closed. I spent the next 6 months building a detailed spreadsheet, tracking every payment she missed, every extension she begged for, every asset she listed as collateral that no longer existed. I monitored her accounts like a hawk, waiting for the moment her cash reserves dipped too low to meet payroll or service the interest. The data was cold and precise, a balance sheet that told the real story of her greed. I didn't want to simply recover the money. I wanted her to look me in the eye and realize the person she once dismissed as a burden now held the rope around her company's neck. Sometimes I wonder if she ever felt a moment of regret. 6 months after I acquired her debt, the intercom on my desk buzzed with Robert's voice cutting through the quiet of my office. My mother had finally broken. She had called his line repeatedly that morning, voice cracking as she pleaded for an urgent meeting to restructure the loans before everything imploded. She sounded desperate, mentioning missed supplier payments and the looming threat of bounced payroll checks. I instructed Robert to arrange it immediately, but to frame the offer tightly: a one-time cash infusion contingent on her signing the full agreement within 48 hours. I made sure he stressed that any delay would push the funds into escrow over the weekend, and when rates rose Monday, the terms would tighten further. It was a fabricated deadline. I controlled the timing completely, but the illusion of scarcity was crucial. Robert delivered the proposal with practiced neutrality, describing it as a rare opportunity from a private creditor willing to overlook certain delinquencies if she moved quickly. Margaret seized it without hesitation. She knew her next payroll was due Friday, and her leased delivery van, the last major asset she clung to, was slated for repossession the following Monday morning. The panic of walking into her warehouse to face angry drivers with no checks or watching the tow truck haul away her final piece of equipment overrode any instinct to read carefully. She confirmed the meeting time and agreed to the preliminary conditions Robert emailed over. I spent the following days assembling the binder, a heavy leather folder that appeared standard on the surface, packed with routine commercial restructuring language. Buried in Clause 14, however, was the confession of judgment, a provision that waived her rights to trial notice appeal or defense in case of default, allowing immediate court judgment and asset seizure if any warranty proved false. I drafted the collateral schedule meticulously listing refrigeration units, delivery trucks, and inventory she had already liquidated or double-pledged elsewhere. The document read like salvation, promising to clear $450,000 in toxic debt, but it was engineered to detonate on the first misrepresentation. Robert would hand it over with a bored professional demeanor, presenting it as boilerplate paperwork required for the rescue, nothing alarming. Margaret would skim the pages, hunting for the disbursement figure, the number that represented breathing room. She would spot the $450,000 as the clean slate she craved and reach for her pen, driven by the ticking clock and the fear of total collapse. Greed, panic, and exhaustion would blind her to the fine print. The trap was locked and the timer had started. Margaret believed she was seconds from rescue. She had no idea the hand extending the lifeline belonged to the daughter she had discarded 5 years earlier. And I still wonder whether she would see the truth before it was too late. I drove to the law building in downtown Miami with the radio silenced, the engine's low rumble the only companion as I mentally replayed every angle of the setup. I parked in the underground garage, took the private elevator to the floor I controlled through a shell company, and slipped into the adjacent soundproofed room where the high-definition feed from the conference suite was already live on my monitor. The webcam light burned steadily, facing the long mahogany table where Margaret and Christopher soon walked in. Margaret led with the same authoritative stride, though the strain had carved sharper shadows under her eyes, and her tailored suit seemed to swallow her frame. Christopher followed, clutching her briefcase, offering the same attentive deference he had once directed at me, back when he believed staying close to power was the smarter play. They settled at the head of the table, scarcely acknowledging the open laptop, as if screens were for people who lacked real influence. Margaret dove straight into her presentation, touting the lasting prestige of her food distribution brand, claiming it still commanded respect in the market, despite what she dismissed as short-term cash flow challenges. She laid out her strategy to take the fresh capital, settle the pressing bills, and roll the debt into another refinance in 6 months, perpetuating the cycle until conditions improved. Christopher nodded supportively, adding that they sought no charity, only acknowledgement of the brand's inherent value and the deep supplier ties she had cultivated over decades. Then my sister Laura joined via video call, her image appearing in a corner of the screen from her home office. She leaned toward the camera, assuring Margaret that the deal would seal once the funds cleared. Laura permitted herself a quick smirk, remarking that I was likely pouring coffee in some low-end diner right now, cursing everyone else for my own choices. Margaret let out a short, sharp laugh, concurring that I had never possessed the resilience for genuine pressure, labeling me a drag on resources that yielded nothing in return. Christopher piled on, saying the family had thrived in my absence without the constant dead weight. They lounged there, picking apart what they saw as my inevitable collapse, exchanging jabs about my supposed fragility, my inability to rise, and my perpetual role as the family disappointment, while calmly mapping out how to keep borrowing and stalling. Their words filtered through the speakers with casual venom, dragging me back to those nights folded in my car windows, misted from my breath, palms pressed to my belly, as I vowed to Sophia that we would escape the same venom. Hearing them strip me down to a joke, I quietly reflected on what someone would do if their own family had ridiculed and discarded them so completely. Would they swallow the humiliation or seize the chance to stand tall and reclaim every piece that had been taken? They remained oblivious that the target of their scorn owned the very building they sat in, and every cutting remark they made was being preserved in razor-sharp clarity for the record. Margaret flipped through the binder with hurried fingers, her eyes scanning for the disbursement schedule, the single page that held the $450,000 she desperately needed to keep her company breathing another month. The 48-hour deadline Robert had stressed hung over her like a blade, and the ticking clock made her pulse race as she reached the signature line. She paused for the briefest moment, glancing at the wall clock, then pressed the pen down and signed, with a swift, looping flourish, the same confident stroke she had always used to mask uncertainty. Robert observed impassively, confirming the signature had been received and declaring the agreement fully executed. Margaret let out a shaky breath, leaning back in her chair, already calculating how quickly she could wire funds to the most pressing suppliers and buy herself another few weeks. She believed she had just pulled off the save that would keep her empire intact. The room went still for a heartbeat, the only noise the soft snap of Robert closing the binder. That was the signal I had waited for. I pushed open the connecting door, stepped into the conference suite in a charcoal-tailored suit, and walked directly to the head of the table. Margaret looked up, annoyed at the interruption. Then her face went ashen as recognition slammed into her. I stood there steady, meeting her gaze, and said, "Hello, Mother. Jennifer Ann Thompson, the creditor you've been dealing with all along." The air thickened with shock. Christopher froze, his hand halfway to the briefcase, eyes wide. Margaret's mouth opened, tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. I didn't give her time to regroup. I slid a slim folder across the polished wood containing time-stamped high-resolution photos from a Miami repossession yard taken the day before, showing the industrial mixers, refrigerated delivery trucks, and storage units she had warranted as collateral, all absent, sold off, or seized long ago. The borrower warrants that the collateral is in possession and lien-free. I recited from Clause 14 the exact provision she had skimmed past. Since it isn't, default is immediate. No grace period, no further discussion. The confession of judgment you signed authorizes entry of judgment without trial notice or appeal. Robert has already e-filed the affidavit with the county clerk. Liens are attaching to your bank account's investments and remaining property right now. Margaret shook her head violently, shoving the photos back, insisting it was impossible, the equipment was still in the warehouse, that this was some elaborate hoax. Her voice rose in pitch, cracking with denial, but the arrogance she had carried into the room was already fracturing. The ink had dried, the mechanism had triggered, and every legal defense she might have claimed was irrevocably waived the instant her signature dried on the page. She stared up at me, the daughter she had branded a burden, now standing as the one who held the keys to her complete undoing. Margaret looked at me with eyes blazing with fury and raw fear. But that wasn't the worst part of her day yet. Margaret slumped forward in her chair, the color still drained from her face as the reality of the immediate default settled over her like a weight she could no longer shrug off. She looked toward Robert, searching for any crack in the judgment, any way to claw back what she had just signed away. Before he could respond, Christopher rose abruptly, pulling a thick envelope from his briefcase and thrust it toward me with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was an ex parte custody order issued that morning by a family court judge granting him temporary sole custody of Sophia, based on an affidavit Margaret had sworn earlier that day. The document accused me of mental instability, erratic behavior, and posing an immediate danger to the child, claiming I was unfit to provide a safe, stable environment. The papers were crisp, freshly printed with the judge's seal and Margaret's signature at the bottom, the same hand that had just doomed her company. Laura's face reappeared on the video call, her expression colder now, as she leaned closer to the camera. She spoke slowly, deliberately. "If you don't release the debt and walk away, you'll never see Sophia again. We'll make sure the courts keep her away from you." The words landed like a blade aimed straight at my heart, the one threat they knew could still make me hesitate. They believed they held the ultimate leverage, the child I had fought to protect from the moment I felt her first kick. I scanned the order, read the affidavit, and recognized the familiar forgery in the details, the exaggerated claims of instability, the fabricated incidents designed to paint me as dangerous. Then I turned to Robert, who had stayed silent during the exchange, his face unreadable. I asked about the retainer Christopher had boasted about for his custody attorney. Christopher held up a check for $15,000 drawn on Margaret's personal account at First City Bank. The account I had frozen 4 minutes earlier when the liens attached the moment her signature dried. The check would bounce, the lawyer wouldn't file a single motion, and he would drop the case before the sun set. Christopher's smile vanished as he stared at the paper, realizing the funds weren't there. Margaret's eyes widened in horror when the implications hit her. Robert cleared his throat and spoke for the first time since the reveal. As an officer of the court, I am obligated to report any perjury committed in my presence. The affidavit you swore today contains material falsehoods, and I will notify the bar and the presiding judge immediately. The room went silent, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning. Christopher crumpled the custody papers in his fist, muttering that he was out and headed for the door without another word. Laura's video feed stuttered as she tried to interrupt, but the connection dropped mid-sentence, leaving her face frozen in panic. Margaret remained seated, staring at me, her eyes, red-rimmed mouth working silently as the last of her control slipped away. The arrogance that had carried her through the meeting had shattered, replaced by raw, desperate fear. When they tried to use Sophia to threaten me, I quietly reflected on what someone would do if their family turned their own child into a weapon against them. Would they choose forgiveness or protect their child at any cost, no matter the price? Margaret looked at me, eyes brimming with tears, mouth stumbling over the words, as she whispered my name for the first time in years. It was the first time in her life she had called me her daughter. They left the conference room in heavy silence. Margaret lasted, her steps slow and unsteady, as though the liens had already begun to pull her down. Within days, her house entered foreclosure, the leased luxury car vanished from the driveway on a tow truck, and the food distribution company filed for Chapter 11, as suppliers and banks closed in on what little remained. The perjury probe launched swiftly, the false affidavit she swore for the custody order, sparking a formal complaint to the bar and the possibility of probation, substantial fines, or worse, from the court. Christopher's name became poison in Miami's business circles. No company would touch him after the collapse became public knowledge, and he faded from the industry he had once navigated so confidently. Laura watched her own social world shrink. Invitations stopped, returning calls dried up, and the family ties she had manipulated for advantage unraveled until she stood alone in the wreckage. The unit they had formed fractured beyond repair, leaving only isolation and regret in its place. I severed every connection permanently. No messages, no lingering contact, no door left cracked for reconciliation. Forgiveness was not on the table, not after the betrayal, the lies, and the attempt to weaponize my own child against me. In America, money can be lost and rebuilt. But when you steal someone's honor and the trust of their blood, you forfeit everything and no rescue comes. I did not pursue this path to ruin them. I pursued it to reclaim the dignity they tried to erase and to make certain Sophia grows up surrounded by truth, not the web of deception that nearly swallowed us both. Family is not the place that wounds you deepest. Family is the place that shields you fiercest. Like and subscribe if this story touched you. Sometimes I still reflect on what family truly means. What about you? Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.